A woman at one of my classes in 770 told me a story about that Rebbetzin. That there was a young Kala, young girl, the daughter of a Shliach, who was living in Crown Heights for a koilel, for the beginning of marriages, as per the course. And she and her chassan had decided that they wanted to live as close to 770 as possible, where they would be able to access 770 and the Rebbe and so forth. And the apartment that they took was right directly above Albany Bakery. I guess you shouldn't say Alav Shalom, but for young people, they don't even know what that means. Albany Bakery is where the bank on Albany and Eastern Parkway is. And the bakery was a real bakery. They didn't just sell bakery goods, but they actually baked through the night. And she lived directly above the store of the bakery. And she discovered that every single morning at a set time, the Rebbetzins' car would drive up to the bakery. The Rebbetzin would sit in the car, and her chauffeur, her driver, Chesed Halbasham Sein Gesund, would get out of the car, go into the bakery, and buy fresh cake and bread, whatever it was, obviously for the Rebbe. And this young lady was very sensitive to the fact that the Rebbetzin was very private, didn't want to be ogled and looked at and revered in this way, so she made sure not to be near the window at those during the window of time that the Rebbetzin made her appearance at the bakery. And she also arranged tactfully, without telling people, that if she had guests in her home, that they wouldn't be the front windows, nobody should notice, and she didn't need people coming into her home to look at the Rebbetzin, and she kept the curtains drawn and so forth. It happened once that a friend of hers was in her home, and this woman was married, I don't know, say 6 or 7 years, had no children. And the hostess, the balabasta, says, I want to tell you something. I've never done this before, but I have a proposal. Every morning at this time, the Rebbetzin comes to the bakery with her driver, and he gets out of the car and he goes and he buys bakery goods for the Rebbe and the Rebbetzin, and she sits in the car. And I usually don't allow people to be at the window. I don't want people to disturb her, but under the circumstances, go and stand by the window. So this young woman went and stood by the window and looked out the window, and the car drove up, and the Rebbetzin was sitting in the car. And after a short period of time, the Rebbetzin actually looked up and they made eye contact. And that night was a Leil Tefillah. And 9 months later, their daughter was born. True story. How do we know the story is true? Because I repeated the story to a group of girls in camp in Parshas when I was there for the summer. And one of the girls, about a 15 or a 16-year-old girl, exclaims excitedly, "That's me!" And it was actually her. This was the girl who was born from this eye contact with the Rebbetzin. I'm telling the story for a reason. But I'm also telling the story simply because I just want to tell the story. And let me move on to a second story of the Rebbetzin, which is also quite well known, that when the Rebbe and the Rebbetzin celebrated their 50th wedding anniversary, Tafshan Lamed Tes, 1979, a huge bouquet of flowers was brought to the house, along with a card. And on the card was written the names of a group of women who at that point were childless, and they were asking the Rebbe for a bracha. So the Rebbetzins assistant, Rabbi Halbashtam, Chesed Halbashtam, took the card, brought it into the Rebbe's study, and brought the flowers to the Rebbetzin. And the Rebbe looked at the card and said to Chesed that the card is addressed to the Rebbetzin. So Chesed Halbashtam, Rabbi Halbashtam says to the Rebbe, but it's a card for brachas. And the Rebbe said very plainly, Zi kenoichet benchen. She's perfectly capable of giving a bracha. And the Rebbe insisted that he take it back and give it to the Rebbetzin. I heard, and I think it's also published, that this same Rabbi Halbashtam, Chesed Halbashtam, apparently once asked the Rebbe, maybe on this occasion, what is the difference between a bracha from the Rebbe and the bracha from the Rebbetzin? What difference is there if you get a bracha from the Rebbe and you get a bracha from the Rebbetzin? And the Rebbe gave an insightful answer. He said, I think the Rebbe asked him if he's ever learned Derech Mitzvah Secha. And if he knew the difference between Mamala Kalalman and Sevav Kalalman. And of course he answered in the affirmative, and then the Rebbe told him the difference is my brachas are like Mamala Kalalman, and the Rebbe's brachas are like Sevav Kalalman. And he explained, my brachas you need to make a keli for. If you don't make a keli, the bracha doesn't manifest, because the brachas are focused and they're very, very specific and tailored. The Rebbe's brachas are like Sevav Kalalman. The Rebbe gives a bracha. It's a koyach for alle gute Sachen, and whether or not the vessel is prepared, the bracha finds a way to manifest. The aforementioned point about Mamala Kalalman and Sevav Kalalman, a bracha that needs a vessel so that it should rest comfortably, and a bracha that needs no vessel because it'll find its way where it needs to be, is to a great extent the ultimate purpose of the Maamar we have in front of us, which is going to take us a while. We're not doing it in 1 week, and we're not going to do it in 2 weeks either. And the Rebbe said, a bracha of a Rebbetzin, you get no matter what. In other words, even if you don't deserve it and you haven't earned it, it's effective. So I'm reminded in context of the relationship between the Tzemach Tzedek and his wife, also the Rebbetzin Chayamushka. The Rebbe the Tzemach Tzedek used to say, Ich halt von ihr Tilim. I have a high opinion of her psalms, of her recitation of psalms. Sie ist die richtige Bas Talmud Chacham. She is the true daughter of a scholar. She was the daughter of the Bittel Rebbe and the wife of the Tzemach Tzedek, and of course the granddaughter of the Alter Rebbe. And the Tzemach Tzedek, whenever he would have issues, he would go into his wife and he would say to her, Zog famir, apor kapitlach tilim, say some tilim for me. In fact, there was an occasion where the Tzemach Tzedek was traveling on a very difficult journey for Askonas Siburis, and he took along tachrichim. He took along shrouds, took along the clothing which you bury people in, because that's how awesome he saw this trip as. He didn't know if he'd return. And of course, the Rebbetzin panicked. And the Tzemach Tzedek's children said to the Tzemach Tzedek, Tata du shreks de mame, you're frightening our mother by being so dramatic and taking tachrichim. And the Tzemach Tzedek's response was, Ich will sie soll sich schrecken. I wanted to be afraid. Soll sie von mir mispalel sein, she should daven for me. Sie is the richtige Bas Talmud Chacham. She is the true daughter of a Talmud Chacham. A Rebbetzin is called Eishes Chover. She has the same authority, the same power as her husband, and the same holiness, the same koiches. We know so many stories about the koiches of a Rebbetzin. The famous story of the Rebbe Marash's Chasane. The Marash was married once, and his Kale, who was also his niece, his brother's daughter, became sick right after Sheva Brachas and died literally 3 months later. And she's buried in the oil in Lubavitch, and as far as I know, we don't even know her name. The Rebbe Marash was shattered, devastated, and his father couldn't console him. And a year or two later, he married his second wife at Rebbetzin Rivka, who was a first cousin. Her mother was the Mittel Rebbe's youngest daughter, and the Rebbe Marash was the son probably of the Mittel Rebbe's oldest daughter, although it's difficult to know, or one of the older daughters, Rebbetzin Chayamushka. And the Shatchanit was the Mittel Rebbe's Rebbetzin Schneur. She very much wanted the Rebbe Marash to marry her granddaughter, who she was in part raising, two daughters whose parents had both died very young, very holy, special people. And she wanted very much that the Rebbe Marash, at least in Zivik Sheni, second time around, should marry one of her younger daughter's son's children. So she came to her son-in-law, the Tzemach Tzedek, and insisted that he should choose one of these girls for a shidduch for the Rebbe Marash. And the Tzemach Tzedek says, I have an offer from Vitebsk, I think for 28,000 ruble, for an extraordinary amount of money, for a gvir who wants his daughter to marry my son. What are you offering me in way of naden that should, so to speak, steer me away of this incredibly generous offer? So she said, I don't have any money, but ich kann dir geben 30 Jahre Eishes Chover ke Chover. I lived 30 years with the Mittel Rebbe, and the power, the koiches, the bracha of living 30 years Mittel Rebbe, that koyach as the wife of a Rebbe is a Rebbe, I'll give to your son, the Rebbe Marash. And the Tzemach Tzedek agreed. And the shidduch was sealed. And the story, of course, goes that the day of the wedding, he called in the Rebbe Marash in the afternoon and says, go into your grandmother and ask her for a bracha now, and insist that she gives you the bracha of Eishes Chover ke Chover. So he went into the kitchen, and the Rebbe Shena, she was the matriarch, she was the senior woman in the home, and she was directing traffic and overseeing all of the cooking. They had to feed thousands of Chassidim, literally. And in walks the Chassan, the Rebbe Marash. How old was he? 16, 15, 16? And he looks over to his grandmother, who was wearing an apron and not clean hands, and he says to her, my father said I should come to you for a bracha. So she says, of course I'll give you a bracha, but not now, before the chuppah. Why now? I'm cooking, busy. So he goes back to his father, and his father says, I want you to go to the Baba now, immediately, and get the bracha. I don't know what the reason, but that's the story. So again, he went back to the Rebbetzin Shena, and the Rebbetzin Shena protested, and he wouldn't move. He says, my father said, now is now. So when the Rebbetzin saw that his last name was Schneur, and that he was stubborn, so she washed her hands. She put her holy hands on his head, and she gave him a bracha, and she said, the strength that I have of 30 years, the wife of a Rebbe, I'm giving to you. And when the Rebbe Marash repeated this to his father, the Tzemach Tzedek, he was very happy. And one final story, if we're talking about the Rebbetzins, is also a similar story with the Rebbetzin Shtene Sora, the previous Rebbe's mother, that she once saw a chassid walking out of her son's room after Yechidus, and the chassid was very shaken because the previous Rebbe used to cry so much that every night after Yechidus, she herself said that there was a puddle of tears on the floor. And she said to this chassid, I think it was Reb Simcha Gorodetsky, amongst other things, she says, Ich bin doch eishes chover kechover, aber macht gut. I have the power of a Rebbe, and the wife of a Rebbe is a Rebbe, but he's doing okay, he's doing fine. In other words, she conceded that her son was the Rebbe, even though she had the koiches as having been the Rebbe of the Rebbe. So the Rebbe, our Rebbe, says that a bracha of a Rebbe is like a bracha of a Rebbe, but it's b'derech makif. The bracha is without any focus, and therefore without any strings attached. It's just a koyach brought into the world that manifests in blessing. Whatever blessing you need, it'll translate into, and whatever measure of preparedness and worthiness one is on or is not, the blessing works. And in Mitzvah Hashem, as this discussion unfolds, you'll understand why I am sharing this with you. Let's move on from Rebbetzins to Rebbes. Chassidim say that there were the three great tzaddikim. The holy Baditchever, Rabbi Baditchever, who was one of the dearest friends of the Alter Rebbe. The holy Rebbe Reb Zusha Mahanepoler, who the Alter Rebbe called a Yedid Nefesh. And the Alter Rebbe. And Chassidim used to say, what is the difference between these three giants? And they would say the following: Reb Zusha saw no fault in a Jew. He just didn't see anything bad. Rabbi Baditchever saw faults in Jews, and he turned them into merit. He showed God how wonderful the Jewish people were. The Alter Rebbe saw faults, and he taught people how to correct them. Three tzaddikim. One simply doesn't see any evil in a Jew. Another one sees evil and spins it to be good. The third sees evil, acknowledges that evil, and works on making people do tshuva and repair it. V'rabim heishev me'yaved. Now, of course, this is not the tzaddik measurement. We're not going to decide which tzaddik is bigger and smaller. But think about what this means. A tzaddik who sees no evil, a tzaddik who sees evil and interprets it as good, and a tzaddik who sees evil and works to transform it into good. What's the difference? The difference is the nature of the tzaddik. Reb Zusha Hanepoler was a very holy man. And he lived in a very holy world. He didn't live in the real world. He lived in a holy world. And when you live in a holy world and you look at people, everybody is as holy as the world of holiness in which you preside. So he saw no evil. The holy Baditchever was more grounded, if you will. He had more of a connection to the world in which we live. So he saw evil, but he would spin it. He would find ways of seeing it only as good. The Alter Rebbe wrote the Sefer Shel Beinanim. Alter Rebbe, as holy as he was, understood our Yetzer Hara. And he wrote a book that addresses not his level in holiness and piety, but addresses ours. So he knew what Yetzer Hara was, he knew what weakness is, he knew what temptation is, and what lust is, and what compromise is, and the struggle of focus and tshuva and so forth. And the Alter Rebbe, from his point of view, engaged in people to such a degree that he would help them repair and correct themselves. So who's greater? What's a higher perspective? What's a holier perspective? And of course, the Alter Rebbe was a Nasi B'Yisrael. Besides being a tzaddik, he was a leader. And that's what leaders do. They engage. And in as much as this is concerned, that's the difference between the Alter Rebbe and certainly Reb Zusha, the Heilige Rebbe, Reb Zusha Mahanepoler. But the difference is your holiness operating on a level of uniformity, because I am holy, my world is holy, or is your holiness operating in a manifest way. A manifest way means when a tzaddik brings his holiness into an unholy world, the conflict requires refinement and specialization. In other words, one, let's say for the sake of argument, is purer, holier, and higher. The other is deeper and more focused and with greater integrity. In other words, what I am suggesting is the difference between the B'zusha Hanapol and the Alter Rebbe is like the difference, as the Rebbe explained, that separates the bracha that you get from the Rebbetzin and the bracha that you get from him. The Rebbe's bracha is focused, pnimius. You have to make a keli for it. While the Rebbetzins bracha is just a wonderful blessing, a wonderful light that just finds 101 ways of providing goodness to people in the world without necessarily having it specialized and tailored. And in the case of the Alter Rebbe, he was a Rebbe. A Rebbe meant to say that he was involved with people, on the people's level, and therefore he identified evil, acknowledged evil, and inspired through effort and work and focus how to repair it in a pnimiistic, in an internalized, in an individual kind of way. In the Maimah we're going to learn tonight, way at the end. In other words, it's going to take us a while to get to it, but I'm saying it now by way of introduction. We're going to be introduced to a pasuk, which is explained in the Gemara, Masechta Sukkah, that speaks of the holiest people, if you will, in all of history, and divides them into two categories. Nesichei Yadam, that means princes, and the Royim, shepherds. The difference between the Nesichim and the Royim will be, as you'll see, that the Nesichei Yadam are holy. Hey, like I mentioned, just very holy people, like Yishai, the father of David. But they don't really have anything to do with the world other than live here. The Royim, the shepherds, on the other hand, are Nesichei Yisrael, Jewish leaders who are involved with people. And according to the Tanakh, and perhaps according to the Chazal, they may have done things that are not so perfect. Because when they're so engaged and involved with a world of inexactness and challenge and compromise, perhaps sometimes there is a unique esachitzenim, inadvertently, and by no fault of their own, they have an indirect responsibility for something that's not ideal. So there's perfect Jews who are perfect in their holiness and their precious and their removal, and deep Jews who are deeply involved in the world, and consequently, because they're deeply involved in the world, it's conceivable that because of the world, something that they do may be construed as an ill act, as a compromise act on their part, notwithstanding they are so holy. And again, the language would be higher and deeper. The Nesichim are higher, the Royim are deeper, like the B'zusha and the Alter Rebbe, like the Rebbe and the Rebbetzin, as I explained to you before. This Maimon is going to explore this. What's better? A specialized, individuated, focused gift, or an over-the-top, generous, transcendent gift? In other words, what is better? To have a tutor, for example, who teaches you on your level, is tuned in not only to your intelligence, but to your mood and to your disposition on a particular day, and is so focused on you that he tailors the material that he teaches you to the exact level that you're at, or walking into a lecture where there are hundreds of participants and the student, the professor, the teacher is giving this very profound class, and on some level he's in effect blowing you away. He's speaking above your head or above your station. But on the other hand, he's enchanting you and he's raising you up because what he's saying is so extraordinary and so lofty. Which is better? Is it better to have somebody teach you on your own level in a limited way? Or is it preferred to have somebody, so to speak, overwhelm you? And in the language of the Maimonic Chassidus, this would be called, and I'll give you the Hebrew, Oir Pnimi, Mitzachtzea Chatzia Klimi Bifnim, a personalized, tailored light or gift will cleanse a vessel from the inside. In other words, a tutor who's tuned into a student as an individual will refine the brain or the mind of that student in a very, very personalized and real way. A transcendent light will scrub, will cleanse the vessel from the outside, which means when you have a teacher who speaks to so many people that as a consequence he speaks a bit or perhaps more than a bit above their heads, he doesn't overwhelm them to the degree that they become dysfunctional. He overwhelms them to the extent that they become enchanted on the one hand or a bit overwhelmed on the other hand. but he agitates them out of their place of complacency and encourages them or challenges them to go beyond themselves. Both of these things in the Lashon and this Maamar, Shneim ke'echet tovim, these are two distinct ideas, both useful and both necessary and both relevant, and that's what this Maamar is going to explore. Using Chanukah candles and the candles in the Menorah in the Beis HaMikdash, or alternatively, mitzvahs and Neshamas Yisrael, the Alter Rebbe is going to explore influences, more meaningful, personalized influences versus more transcendent, perhaps overwhelming kind of influences, as they're represented by a variety of different themes in this Maamar. One of them is Chanukah versus Sukkot, the Menorah versus the Menorah of Chanukah, the Menorah in the Beis HaMikdash versus the Menorah of Chanukah, and so forth. And we'll get to that in due time. So take this introduction. I'm sure you enjoy the stories. I did. Put it on a shelf, but on a low shelf. Keep it handy. You're going to need it over the next couple of weeks. Let us now begin the Maamar. And bear in mind that the beginning of the Maamar will reflect almost nothing of the introduction that I gave you. So Tanu Rabanan, the Gemara teaches us, Mitzvah Neir Chanukah v'chuli. There's a mitzvah to light Chanukah candles. And of course, you know what the Gemara goes on to say, it's when the sun goes down, Al Pesach Beis Mibechutz, on the left side, after dark, outside, and so forth and so on. And one of the questions is, how many candles do you light? B'Shamai says the first day you light 8. And with the passing of days, you diminish from 8 to 7 to 6 to 5. As the Rebbe says in his Sichos, because they go Basar Keach, how many days are left? Like the oxen on Sukkot. That on Sukkot they brought 70 cows, 70 oxen in the Beis HaMikdash, but they would decrease it one each day, 13, 12, 11, 10, 9, 8, 7, over the course of 7 days. And it corresponds, of course, to the 70 nations of the world, and they're going from a higher level to a lower level. And Beis Shammai holds that Chanukah licht, like the oxen or the cows brought on Sukkot in the Beis HaMikdash, should go from a higher level to a lower level. Beis disagrees. The first day you light only one candle, each subsequent day you increase. In other words, as the Maamar is going to explain later, Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel don't argue about Sukkot. They both agree that when it comes to Sukkot, as the Torah Or states, you go Peiches v'Heilech, the Pariyachah go down. The question is, should we compare Chanukah licht to Sukkot? Beis Shammai says yes, and Beis Hillel says no. And therefore, Beis Hillel gives a much more practical or a much more uniform, reasonable insight that the first night you light one, the second night two, and so forth, because of the principle of Ma'ala Makedesh v'Yein Medidin. He's supposed to grow in holiness. And this is the argument between Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel. They both agree that on Sukkot you go down. On Chanukah, Beis Shammai says you also go down. Beis Hillel says you also go up. Why? What's the connection between Chanukah candles and the cows of Sukkot? That by Sukkot everybody agrees you're going down, and Chanukah we, according to Beis Shammai, compare it to Sukkot, and according to Beis Hillel we disagree. Says the Rebbe Nagda Mashakosov. Moving on to something else, and let me put it to you directly. Forget the Chanukah candles. It'll be a couple of weeks before we revisit Chanukah candles. That's it. We're done. Okay, Chanukah candles are either compared or not compared to Parei HaChag. This is an argument Beis Shammai Beis Hillel, as the Rebbe would say, or Kafi Sheyes Bayla Kaman. But we're moving on to something else. Says the Rebbe, it says in the Pasuk Neir Mitzvah v'Teira that mitzvahs are like candles, and Teira is like light. In other words, Shah mitzvahs nekroyim Neir. Mitzvahs are compared to candles. V'gam Ksiv, there's another pasuk that's written Neir Avaya Nishmas Adam, that the Jewish soul is also compared to a candle. In other words, Shah Neshama Nikra Neir, that the Neshama too also is called a candle. Now, let me be direct. Our Maamar is only going to talk about Neir, about the idea of a candle. It's not going to discuss Torah Or. It's not going to talk about the light of Torah, only the candle of Mitzvah. So let's leave Torah Or alone. Mitzvahs are candles and the Neshamas are candles. What does a candle mean? In most places in Chassidus, including in this Maamar, a candle means everything but the flame. To have a candle, you need a cup, or a candelabra, a candle holder. You need fuel, oil or wax, a wick, and then a fire. In most Maimarim, not in all, but in most Maimarim, whenever the illusion of Neir is used, whether it's Neir Mitzvah or Neir Nishmas Adam, it's not about the fire and the light, it's about the candle. In other words, mitzvahs and the Neshamas Yisrael are not light and fire. They're conductors of light and fire. And our Maamar is intent on exploring what it means that mitzvahs and the Neshamas Yisrael are conductors of light and fire, and how different they are. What's the difference between the mitzvahs conducting light and fire and the Neshamas Yisrael conducting light and fire? But the key thing to understand at the outset is they're both candles, like the Rebbe brings in the Maamar, lansish balaz. The French word for a naid is lansish, a candelabra, as opposed to the fire itself. Ubezei and Mavur, the Zeh uses another word to denote candle. Be it candle of mitzvah or candle of neshama, sham mitzvahs nekraim levushim. The mitzvahs are called garments. Asher neshama mislabeshes ben began eden, that a neshama that is itself a levush for mitzvahs, for neid havaya, that says in this Maamar, the neshama in Gan Eden need the garment of mitzvahs in order to experience the light, as we'll see later on. In other words, another word for neid is levush. Mitzvahs are a levush, and the neshamas are a levush. And in fact, the Gan Eden, the neshama needs the levush of a mitzvah to accommodate the neshama's ends. Though the neshama itself is a levush, but the neshama in Gan Eden needs the help of the levush of mitzvahs to facilitate something on behalf of the neshama, as you'll see momentarily. So the Rebbe says, first of all, every soul must fulfill all 613 mitzvahs. So the garment be whole. It says in Kabbalah, Shara Galgulim and Sefer Galgulim, that there's 600,000 souls that have 600,000 sparks apiece that collectively have to do the whole Torah and practice all the mitzvahs on all 4 levels of Parshas and collectively raise up all of the world. As Alter Rebbe discusses it briefly in Tanya chapter 37. But each neshama has to learn the whole Torah and has to do all the mitzvahs. And if one fails to do even one mitzvah, the garment is missing, and the neshama would have to descend into this world to fulfill, to satisfy the mitzvah that it's missed, to complete its garments. Every neshama needs to be whole, and you're only whole if you've studied all 4 levels of Torah, Pardes, in their entirety, and done all the Taryag mitzvahs. Now, Rebbe in Tanya Chavtes, Igeres HaKedesh 29, speaks about the mitzvahs of a king, for example, that the king is yoy to all of us because we can't possibly do all the mitzvahs the king does. We're not kings. The question, of course, becomes, what about a king gadol? But every neshama comes in multiple galgulim until does all of the mitzvahs, because by doing all the mitzvahs, we are conductors of all of the lights. And he says, though a neshama by itself is a keli, is a levush, and mitzvahs by themselves are a keli, are a levush. In Gan Eden, the levush of mitzvahs assist the neshama. And you'll see later on that that's sometimes in reverse. But in Gan Eden, the neshama, which is itself a kli, needs the kli, the levush of mitzvahs, for some end, for some purpose. The Rebbe goes on to say, Gan Eden, what happens in Gan Eden? The souls are having delight, pleasure from the rays of the Shechina. And in case you don't know what the rays of the Shechina means, the Maamar immediately continues and interprets. The rays of the Shechina in Gan Eden, it's a shine from the Ein Sof, which touches and illuminates individual neshamas in Gan Eden. And therefore, the souls in Gan Eden are delighted by this experience. That they have an access to and a reach and a sensitivity of or for. Some trace may haziv from this ray or shine, ubechinas haziv, when this shine, who ha'ara Ein Sof bli gavul, is a shine of the Ein Sof, and a little bit of Ein Sof is Ein Sof. So the neshama in Gan Eden is able to experience Ein Sof. And let me stop for a moment and share with you the insight. Neshamas in Gan Eden's business is hasaga, like angels. They're busy understanding godliness, especially in B'riyah. Understanding godliness. Naturally, a neshama in Gan Eden understands godliness a lot better than we ever will as a neshama b'guf. It doesn't have distractions, it doesn't have interruptions. But it's still only understanding. It's called hasaga salakus. Because the neshama in Gan Eden is only understanding godliness, the neshama in Gan Eden is limited, and its relationship to Hashem is from a distance. They're not experiencing godliness, they're simply comprehending, intellectually understanding godliness. And that's it. The neshama can't do anything about it. When a neshama comes out into this world, learns Torah, does mitzvahs, and of course, as this Maamar is going to explore later on, is Esek and Avedas Abirudim, struggles with darkness and transforms it and raises it up. The neshama now gains that when it returns to Gan Eden, it will not only understand godliness, it will experience the pleasure of the godliness that it's understanding. Or said slightly differently, when you understand something, from the understanding comes a pleasure. And in Gan Eden, the pleasure that comes from understanding godliness is the godliness itself. So before the neshama ever existed in this earth, it only understands godliness. Its medida v'agbala narkav is limited. When the neshama returns after being on earth, it has what's called tainug hasaga, not just a comprehension of godliness, but a delight, experience of the pleasure of the Ein Sof. Now, I'm going to say it now, although perhaps I could wait a few more lines before I share this with you. Throughout Chassidus, when they want to talk about the Ein Sof, they give one of two mishalim, one of two illustrations, one of two examples or analogs. Although the stories of Chassidim, we used to give 21 or 22 mishalim for the Ein Sof and so forth. But from what I know in Chassidus, there are pretty much two mishalim for the Ein Sof, as a rule. The first is Ratzon, willpower. And of course, in willpower, the comparison between will and the Ein Sof is the power, the urgency, the uncontrollable passion, which is beyond reason. But in will, you have represented only the strength of the Ein Sof, not the beauty of the Ein Sof, not the subtlety of the Ein Sof, not the richness of the Ein Sof, not the harmony of the Ein Sof. So the mashal, the illustration that provides the second half of understanding what the Ein Sof is pleasure, tainug, delight. Now pleasure doesn't feel strong. To the contrary, an argument can be made that when one experiences pleasure, it actually makes them feel weak, and there's some credibility to that. It's sort of anticlimactic and resolution and so forth. But the second mashal for Ein Sof is tainug. So Ratzon would represent the mashal for the power of the Ein Sof, and tainug would represent the mashal for the richness and subtlety and nuance of the Ein Sof. Why pleasure? Why pleasure? Why not taste? Why not something else? Why not heat? And the answer is because pleasure is an experience that has to do with the soul. And I'll explain this briefly. What is pleasure? Pleasure is a good feeling that you get from something. I eat tasty food, I get pleasure. I wear nice clothing, I get pleasure. I drive a nice car, I get pleasure. I feel healthy, I feel strong, I feel attractive, I get pleasure. I study Torah, I get pleasure. I do a mitzvah, I get pleasure. I help another person, I get pleasure. All kinds of delights, all kinds of pleasure. What do we know about pleasure? That it feels good. And because it feels good, we want to keep doing it, which is why, of course, people overeat. Feels good to eat, so because it feels good, you do it. And now if you don't like the fact that you overeat and you feel sad or depressed about the fact that you don't overeat, sometimes you'll overeat again to forget your pain of overeating because it makes you feel good, and then you'll feel even worse. But pleasure feels good. So what is the dynamic? What is the philosophy of pleasure? And the answer is simply the following. We are people with a soul. The soul is in our body. The levels of the soul that are in our body are only the peripheral, the lowest levels of the soul, which we often call the naran, enters into the body at best, and the chaya yechida does not. The nature of the physical universe, the nature of the physical person, and therefore the nature of the human soul, in as much as it's in a human body, is that we are all born chassid, lacking. You have a brain, you have no intelligence, no knowledge. You have a heart, you have no feelings. You have senses, you have no sophistication. You have to develop it. It's all potentia. Chassid. We are born diminished, lacking. And of course, therefore, we're all driven to satisfy those lacks, to fulfill those lacks, to make me whole, for example, by studying knowledge, Torah, and filling my mind with actual knowledge, and my heart, and my senses, and so forth. And life is about the pursuit of a lack. And of course, you can pursue the lack of knowledge by the acquisition of knowledge, but you can also pursue a lack of money or desire for more money, which is not exactly the same thing. But the principle is constant. In this world, because the very nature of the reality is that everything is koyach and not poel, potential, not actual, we're all in a state of neediness, which creates a frustration and a fear and all those other things which we don't like. What about Gan Eden? What about on high? What about in the spiritual worlds? Gan Eden and the spiritual worlds don't know what chisaron means. There's no such thing as lack. Every potential is realized. If there's a possibility for wisdom, you're actually wise. A possibility for kindness, you're actually kind, and so forth. So up there, the neshama lacks nothing. Down here, the neshama lacks everything. So God Almighty created a very interesting link between the conscious and the subconscious of the neshama. The neshama, quote, down here, and the neshama up there. And that is, that if I eat even food, or wear nice clothing, or study a Maamar Chassidus Lav, I will enjoy it. I'll get a delight. What is the pleasure dynamic? What does it feel like to have pleasure? Having pleasure means the conscious person is temporarily raised up into the subconscious, into the level in the neshama where there is no lack, where everything exists actually. And that feels wonderful. When you learn a Maamar, you've studied only one Maamar. What do you know? One Maamar. But the delight of that Maamar is the delight of all of Chassidus. It's the light of the soul itself, which is why the pleasure that comes from learning is considered infinite. The learning itself is finite. The food itself is certainly finite. The clothing is certainly finite, and so forth. But the delight and the pleasure is a feeling of called this alabat musay. The conscious person is being raised up to the level of his subconscious, and the subconscious lacks for nothing. And that feeling is a feeling of delight and pleasure, and I think it would be appropriate to also use the word euphoria, notwithstanding its negative connotations. That euphoric experience is an experience not of one thing but having, because what's happening when I'm experiencing delight is I'm going up to the level of my neshama, which in fact lacks nothing, which in fact has everything. Therefore, when Chassidus wants to describe infinity, they use will for the power of the Ein Sof, and they use delight, they use tainik for the richness of the Ein Sof. The experience of delight is experiencing the richness of the infinity of the soul. That means to say that the soul has no lacks. So now, think about the difference between a neshama that's never been born and a neshama that's been born and lived and died and returned to Gan Eden. Both understand godliness, perhaps exactly the same. But the first only understands, which is a limited, wanting experience. The second understands godliness and then experiences the delight of the godliness that he's attempting to understand. He's experiencing the Ein Sof. There's an extraordinary difference. There's a huge difference. So when the neshamas come down into this world and we say, Yerida Tzorech Aliyah, it's worth it. We were here, we went away, and we came back, but we returned not just with knowledge, but with delight from that knowledge, with the pleasure that comes from that knowledge. This is why neshamas are born, to come down into this world, to study Torah and do mitzvahs, to earn much godly delight associated with the Torah and the mitzvahs that I'm studying and that I'm experiencing. And when a neshama is going to return to Gan Eden, I will experience the delight of the Torah and mitzvahs in that world. And as our Maamar here is telling us, using the garments of the mitzvahs that we perform during our physical lifetime. So that's the difference. Hasaga versus Tainug Hasaga. But there's one more piece to this puzzle, which you'll see momentarily, which is that you have to have a conductor for it. You can understand godliness in Gan Eden by yourself. But the pleasure of the Ein Sof connected to that understanding, you need help with. And this is what the garments of our Maamar are about. Helping the neshama experience not just the understanding of godliness, but the delight of godliness requires a garment, a lavush, and this garment is called Ner Mitzvah, the candle of mitzvahs, which becomes a garment for the Ner Neshama, for the Jewish soul to experience not just the understanding of godliness, but the delight, the Ein Sof of godliness, which comes from the understanding. And one last point. Ein Sof is infinite, but Ein Sof is one. So there shouldn't really be levels in Ein Sof. However, Ein Sof can be murkav. When I get delight from learning one idea, and you get delight from learning a second idea, and he or she gets delight from learning a third idea, and a fourth idea, and a fifth idea, the delight is the same. The triggers of the delight is different. The spark, the initiators of delight is different. So Kabbalah and Chassidus argued, you have this beautifully in Samach Vov, the second Maamar and the third Maamar of Samach Vov, that accordingly there are many, many levels, in fact an infinite number of different types of Gan Eden. Many different ways of experiencing the delight of the Ein Sof, although the Ein Sof is one, because since it's Taineg Amurkav, the delight of Neshama and Gan Eden is not the essence of godliness, but the shine of godliness, which is the delight from my learning, If today I learn one thing, and tomorrow I learn something different, and the day after I learn something else, each day I'm experiencing the delight of the Ein Sof, because the delight of the Ein Sof is murkiv, is juxtaposed against a different, limited thing, accordingly the delights will be different. And therefore there are as many different types of experiencing godliness as there are individual neshamas, on individual moments learning individual ideas, because they're experiencing the godliness through the intellect, if you will, through the garment, if you will. And therefore you have what the Rebbe Rashab calls bli gevul madreges in Gan Eden. Ein Sof is one, but the hasagas are many. So the Alter Rebbe now says, we want to understand. The neshama lived, the neshama died, and back to Gan Eden. They should be having delight from the Torah mitzvahs that they did. But in order to experience it, it needs the garment, the neshama by Gan Eden, the soul in Gan Eden. As I said to you before, perhaps later on, we'll discover the other side of the coin. And the other side of the coin is that the mitzvahs need the neshama to conduct its light. At the moment, we're talking about the neshama needing the mitzvahs to conduct its light. And the Rebbe says inside pretty much what I just told you orally. So let's read it inside. Line 8. What's going on high in Gan Eden? The souls are benefiting from the light of the Shekhinah, from the rays of the Shekhinah. And the idea of these rays, who ha'ara is a shine, from the infinity of godliness. The souls in paradise are delighted. They're experiencing, they're reaching some shine of this Ein Sof. And this shine, who is a shine of Ein Sof, which is infinite, and a little bit of Ein Sof is Ein Sof. Says the Rebbe, and therefore the truth must be told. Though basically we speak of two Gan Edens. Gan Eden Elyon beBriya, a higher Gan Eden in the world of Briya, Gan Eden Tachna beYetzira, lower Gan Eden in Yetzira. But if you really want to break it down, there are as many different paradises as there are individual masigim and asagas. There are as many different individual levels of Ein Sof as there are masigim and asagas. There are an infinite number of possible ways of understanding godliness, and correspondingly an infinite number of ways of experiencing the delight of that godliness itself. Tzadikim continue growing from strength to strength ad infinitum. On this hour, the souls continue to ascend and have continued to ascend. Higher and higher still. There's no limit to how high the neshama can go in understanding godliness, and the higher it goes, the deeper we'll understand. The light and the shine. Which is the light of the Ein Sof. And therefore, if there are different ways of understanding godliness, there are different experiences of the godliness itself, till infinity. Says the Rebbe, anytime a soul needs to go from one Gan Eden to another. So now, if the difference between one Gan Eden and the second Gan Eden would simply be in comprehension, so the distance between one Gan Eden and the next would be limited, and in that case you could sort of build, like the Rebbe says in the second Maamar of Samachov, you understand this well and then you understand better. It's cumulative. But since when the neshama was here and returns, he's experiencing the Ein Sof, the delight that comes from that understanding, and since the delight is infinite, so two different delights on two different levels of understanding are not just both infinite, but they're infinitely different from one another. And therefore, the neshama cannot build on the old to reach the new. The neshama has to erase the old in order to achieve the new, like it says in the Maamar in Samach Vav. Rab Zera had to fast to forget Talmud Yerushalmi, to learn Talmud Bavli, because you make them a quantum leap. Says the Rebbe, in order for neshama to go from a Gan Eden to a Gan Eden, since it's making a quantum change in a unlimited way, it needs to have Bechinas Nahadin, or the idea of the river of fire. To remove all preconceptions from before, because the old comprehension is not only lower than the new comprehension, it's in conflict and contradiction with the new comprehension, and needs to be removed. The earlier understanding, when compared to the higher understanding, says the Rebbe, you cannot compare it. It is completely insignificant and of no value relative to the higher understanding. Because Shasagas, and now each level of understanding is not simply understanding intellectually, but experiencing the Ein Sof. Shasog is an aliyas masek ha'adamid and save baruch. Though the neshama is first of all understanding a concept in godliness, and one concept godliness, and a second concept of godliness are separated in a limited way, but the delight from that comprehension makes them distinct in an infinite way. Imkain therefore kol hasaga yeseda, every higher level of understanding. Shamasek me'ed hasaga shalamata, that he reaches from the light, relative to what he understood before, is hasaga shalamata b'leila kenegda. The earlier understanding is buttle in comparison. And therefore, the neshama has to go through a river of fire to be purged, and to completely forget the old comprehension as the basis for going into the new one. Well, for this same reason, says the Rabbi in the Maamar, says the Rebbe called tzaddik nich v'mechupatech. The Gemara says that each tzaddik is burnt by the aura of his fellow. Every tzaddik creates an aura around himself. This aura takes up space beyond his immediate area of presence. And anybody who enters into that critical space is in the space of the tzaddik and feels that aura, and it burns him. So two tzaddikim more near one another, the chuppah, the aura, which surrounds each, crosses over into the space of their fellow and burns their fellow. They're both holy, they're both involved in infinity. But because they're distinct people and their hasagas are different, the tainug is different, and it becomes an infinite distinction between one experience of infinity and a second experience of infinity. Since each one's perception hovers over his fellow, because they're in similar space. Because no two understand alike. Each one understands slightly differently. I love that through the understanding they experience godliness. Thus, the separation between one and the next is not simply a question of how well or not well one understands godliness, but how sensitive and how tuned in one is to the godliness itself. And this is what the Chassidishe says. They're holy. It goes on the Shama Yisrael. Every day. Yahalucha. Those, I'm going to translate Yahalucha as it's translated so often in Chassidishe to reveal, to shine. Godliness, Sela, in an infinite way. And the Maamar interprets. Who are the holy ones, Neshamas? And then Kniknu Kadeshim, they're called holy. And Yahalucha, Sela. They shine godliness in a way of Sela. And the Gemara says, anytime the word Sela is used to begin as believable, it's an infinity, because the godly perception that comes from the learning is in fact an infinity. They're constantly being renewed in their perception and comprehension. May aid itself on the infinite godly light. You understand one thing today in one way and tomorrow in a different way and then the third day in a third way. That although, as far as the understanding is concerned, the separation between one and the next is finite, but the delights are removed infinitely. Asher believable. So Gan Eden is about experiencing godliness, not God. Ziv and ha'ora of the Eibishter. And the godliness is experienced b'derech harkova. It's juxtaposed against the understanding that we had. And as you'll see soon, this is why we have garments in Gan Eden, in order to conduct the godliness which we're bringing to ourselves, so that we can experience the godliness that we achieved through our Torah mitzvahs in our physical lives. And since Gan Eden is so delightful, so extraordinary, Amar Azal, the Gemara says, it's worth to be judged and go through purgatory, hell, to come to Gan Eden. It's worth any suffering. Now, when you think about the fact that it's going to bring you to experiencing the delight of godly comprehension. That even though the first Gan Eden is so much lower than the Gan Edens above it. Each lower Gan Eden is insignificant compared to the Gan Eden above it. Nevertheless, even the lowest Gan Eden is an infinity and worthwhile. Because these delights come from the Ein Sof. That is Meker Kol HaTanugim, the source of all delight, Heim Bli Gevul, are infinite. And like I explained to you before, the very experiencing of delight is an experience of euphoria, which is a delusional feeling. It's not a healthy feeling. But what you're experiencing is the wholesomeness of the soul that has no lacks, and you therefore temporarily perceive yourself as having no lacks. As we see, in fact, about physical pleasures that they feel infinite. Even when we experience physical delights, from physical things that once were Kabbalistically very lofty and fell through a mystical process called Shviras HaKelim, who gam kein shir, also infinite. The pleasure even from food or from music or from art or dance can be delightful, can be a virtual infinity. There's all different types of delights. It's known, and this diversity of different delights has no limit and no end. So we see even in physical pleasures, there's so many different varieties, and each one of them is such a rich experience that the idea of delight is an idea of the juxtaposition of infinity. And if it's true of physical delight, it's certainly true of spiritual delights. Well, and for this reason, therefore, how much more so, Chassidishe Parsha is at the root and source, which is Tainu Gruchni, spiritual delights. Even as experienced in the very lowest Gan Eden, who believe is infinite. And for this reason, the neshama comes into this world and struggles with the Yetzirah to learn Torah and do mitzvahs to retrieve the garments of the mitzvahs, bring them to Gan Eden so that it can conduct an experiencing the Tainug HaSoga, the Ein Sof of the Rebbe. However, says the Maamar, the soul, which is right here being called finite, and like I said to you before, conceivably, later on this is going to change. But we're viewing the neshama as an intellectual. Intellect, as rich as it may be, is finite. And the neshama, therefore, is limited. It cannot access the revelation of the shine of godliness, which is infinite, which is an essence of godliness. You therefore need a garment. And the neshama cannot be its own garment. The neshama needs the garment of a mitzvah that's going to conduct and temper, control, and make more streamlined, more consistent the delight that the person is getting from the Torah mitzvahs that they're performing, and also limit the experience of the light so that the neshama should be able to experience it. Just like physically, people wear reflectors, and the reflectors bring the heat to them or deflect the heat away from them. So the garment brings the warmth to the body of the person. Similarly, the mitzvahs act as conductors or garments to bring the godliness to the person. Like I've told you the story many times before, it's brought in Kisvei Arizal, that there was one great tzaddik who became a big Rasha, and one big Rasha who became a big tzaddik. Namely, the Rabbi ben Dordaya was the Rasha his whole life. At the last moment he did tshuva, and Yechin and King Gadol, who was a big tzaddik, at the last moment of his life he became a tzduki, a Rasha Napakir. So the Rasha who became a tzaddik came l'mayla. He has a huge portion in Gan Eden, but because he didn't do any mitzvahs and he has no garments, he's sitting in the highest levels of Gan Eden in the dark. So they had Rachmanas on him, and they gave him the mitzvahs of Rabbi Yechin and King Gadol. That he had gone from the highest level to the lowest level. He couldn't use his mitzvahs because he was Peshem or Meredim and so forth. So his mitzvahs were given to Rabbi ben Dordaya. So you need the light of the mitzvahs, and this Rabbi ben Dordaya had in abundance because of the power of his tshuva. But the garments to conduct it, he needed, and this is why a neshama needs mitzvahs. And like I said to you before, later on in the Maamar, you're going to see the concept of the mitzvahs, or what have you, needing Neshamas Yisrael also as a garment, because Neshamas Yisrael also are called Ner Havaya Nishmas Sada. Kiyim, I'm holding on line 25, it's impossible for the Neshama to experience the delight of godliness unless Ayidei Levush, through a garment, Shebchinas Masach, which acts as a screen. Ayidei Levush Masach, through this garment and screen, through this limiting but embodying factor, the neshama can experience the light. You think about it in these terms. If you don't have a conductor to bring light to you, you're sitting in a room full of light, and it's dark. Gan Eden is full of light. To experience the light of Gan Eden, you need garments. Those garments are revealing the light to you, but they're also compromising the light, because every revelation is considered a tzimtzum, like it says in many places in Chassidus. As Kabbalah says, there's a curtain that on the one hand diminishes the light, on the other hand reveals and brings the light to the creation. For example, a great light, you can't look at the powerful light like, for example, the sun itself, because it's so strong. Mavdil, when there's a curtain that separates, that doesn't separate altogether, it separates and allows the light to come through at least in part. All Yechelim Lakabalas, the light becomes palatable, receivable. Considering that the Ein Sof was diminished a little bit, Ayadei Masach through this curtain. So the screen that the neshama uses, which is mitzvahs, to conduct the light of tainug of mitzvahs that the neshama performed during its physical lifetime, is both a garment that brings the light of the neshama, but also limits it. For example, the intelligence, the intellect of a very big scholar. It's impossible to explain it to an immature and unintelligent person. If you insist on explaining it to a simple person, you need a garment and an analog. That through the mashal, through bringing the ideas down to his level, Mavin Hadover, the child is able to understand it. But if you wouldn't bring it down to the child's level, they'll never be able to understand it. It says the Rebbe 4 lines from the bottom, page 28. 3 lines from the bottom, page 29. Mitzvahs are corresponding, also called garments. They conduct the light of godliness to the neshama. Shem gam kim b'chinas mashal, they're also called a mashal. Was the pasuk says mashal lakadmeini, the mashal from what came before time. This goes on the Torah. Shahainu, this means she is galas etzem ratzon ein sof. That there should be a revelation of the essence of the Ein Sof. This is impossible. No creation can house, can case, can be a seat for the Ein Sof. When godliness is brought onto physical action, so you're, so to speak, limiting and containing the godliness, and this allows you to receive it through Ma'aseh mitzvahs, through the deed of performing mitzvahs. What the Alter Rebbe is going to explain here is another point. The issue is, mitzvahs in this world give you the delight of the Hasaga in Gan Eden, which means the infinity that comes from the infinity, and you need the garments of mitzvahs to bring that infinity to yourself. Like a mashal which brings a nimshal to a person. And through the mitzvah that we perform, we're able to access the godliness which we've generated through our physical lives. Which is why mitzvahs are called garments, because through the garments we're able to experience the Ein Sof. This brings out how the mitzvahs or the garments are limiting. They limit the Ein Sof so that we should be able to receive a small portion of the Ein Sof that we're able to receive. Says the Rebbe, however, there's another side to this coin. So far we're seeing mitzvahs as candles. That means candlesticks, holders of fuel and light and fire. In order for godliness to be able to be manifest, and the vessels by themselves are limited and limiting. But there's another side to this coin. And the other side to this coin is what we're about to learn. And the other side to this coin, which we're about to learn, which is the last line, page 31, line 31, is what says in the Igeres HaKodesh Chavtes. I don't know how familiar you are with the Tanya. I certainly don't know how familiar you are with the Igeres HaKodesh Chavtes, but bear with me a few minutes. The previous Rebbe relates a story which is very poignant. It's poignant because it's so edel, so deep. One day he comes into his father, the Rebbe Rashab, and he sees that he's in the process of preparing himself to go to the Ohel, to his resting place of his father, the Rebbe Marash, and his grandfather, the Tzemach Tzedek. Now the Rebbe Nishma said the Rebbe Rashab had a schedule when he visited the Ohel. This was not on the schedule. So he says to his father, Tatanu, why are you going to the Ohel today? He says, I got a letter from Yankov Mutter, from his dear friend of Yankov Mordechai, who was the Paltiel Rov. And his last name was Bespalov, for the record. And he asked that I should go to the Ohel and ask something for him on his behalf. So the Frierdiker Rebbe said, every time he asks, you have to grant his wishes. Wait. He says, yeah. Whenever Yankov Mutter Paltiel will ask, I will go, because I am eternally indebted to him. Why? Eret Megerat Evet Amincha. Rabbi Yankov Mutter Paltiel once woke up the Rebbe Nishma Seiden in an afternoon nap after having not slept for days and days and days, and he prevented him from missing a mincha. And with the Rebbe Rashab, this was so precious that for the rest of their mutual lives, he was indebted to Rabbi Yankov Mutter. He wouldn't turn him down because of this. He saved him a mincha, which is only a mitzvah derabanan. But it brings out just how precious the acts of mitzvahs are. And in fact, Tanya, chapter 35, the Alter Rebbe says, and I'm using now my own words, what's better? To be in love with God, to be passionate about God, or simply to, for example, shake a lulav? Now, on the surface of it, it would seem so obvious that being in love and passionate about God takes precedence over doing a mitzvah. But in reality, that's not the case. It's the other way around. Because any love and passion you have for God is a reflection not of God, but of you and your capacity to be passionate. Moreover, there's a phenomenon called yesh mishayev. At the center of love is ego. When I do a mitzvah, I'm connecting to God, mitzvah, lashon, tzavsa, v'chibur, on God's terms. And I'm connecting through bittul, through submission. And as a consequence, it's the physical deed of a mitzvah has much more infinity than all the kavanah in the world. The Rabbi says in Tanya, when you do a mitzvah, you have bittul. The bittul is the basis for the resting of the Shekhinah. When you're passionate about God, there isn't bittul, there is ego, and you're in effect not a vessel for the Shekhinah. So the second point here is that not only mitzvahs conduct light, mitzvahs have a very high source, a very high source of godliness. Now, the reason this is important is because, imagine you wanted to burn a fire that's 100,000 degrees hot using a tree, a piece of wood. That's foolish. 100,000 degrees is, a star. To burn a star, you need fuel that can sustain that kind of heat. A tree will be gone and so quickly that the heat will never have a chance to even manifest itself. Similarly, if you want to conduct Ein Sof, godliness, infinity, and you're using a garment that's acting as a conductor to reveal the godliness and to contain the godliness, what's to prevent that godliness from being overwhelmed? That garment from being overwhelmed? And of course the answer is the garment's qualification to hold the Ein Sof. If the garment can hold the Ein Sof, the garment must itself be Ein Sof. And that's why the garment for the godliness in Gan Eden is physical mitzvahs. Because physical mitzvahs, they may not feel godly, but they're infinite. And the physical mitzvahs in their infinity are the appropriate conductors of the infinite delight of godliness, of the light of God, which is brought to the neshama in Gan Eden. You know what it's like? It's like cutting diamonds. How do you cut diamonds? Using diamond dust. Nothing in the world is harder than a diamond, and only a diamond can cut a diamond. Nothing in the world can conduct Ein Sof except for Ein Sof. Mitzvahs, they don't feel Ein Sof, but they are Ein Sof, and therefore they're good conductors of the light of Ein Sof. And I'm reading on. Therefore, in addition to mitzvahs being garments that reveal and limit godliness to bring it to the neshama, it's also true. Nikrayim mitzvahs lavush, the mitzvahs are called garments. V'sheidesh ha-mitzvahs gavaya miyed. Mitzvahs have to have a very high source, like it says in Tanya Chavtes. Because mitzvahs come from such a high level, are they themselves a garment of Ein Sof and therefore appropriate conductors of the light of Ein Sof. Shesharshim b'chinas kesed elyon, their sources from the highest levels of kesed, taracham udiyeh, the 620 beams of light. And although v'nishtalshlo, they shaidet v'chol, they come down through very, very thin channels called hairs, down to this world. Halachas are called shaidas, hairs, because in a halacha you see only what to do, you don't see why. They've manifest down here basiyah, gashmis, and physical actions. Tzitzis v'sukkah, by doing physical tzitzis and physical sukkah. However, although the Ein Sof has come down through physical acts, those physical acts are the Ein Sof itself. And therefore, the physical acts of mitzvahs, be they since they are Ein Sof, are conductors of the light and the delight of the Ein Sof. Ubehem dafken, in them and through them, nizgal, let it any yizbarach, and the will of God be revealed. Seif ma'aseh b'machshava tchila, the final act is connected to the original thought. No, as chalasam b'seif, and what happens at the end is planted in the very beginning. In other words, the physical mitzvahs we do down here are the ratzon elyon that goes till atzmos, and therefore in a mitzvah, whether I feel it or not, there is Ein Sof. And therefore mitzvahs since they themselves are Ein Sof, can conduct the light of the Ein Sof. And the Rebbe explains why physical mitzvahs are so lofty. Line 34. Sometimes it says Bereishis bara Elokim es hashamayim v'ha'aretz shamayim tchila. Sometimes when we describe creation, it indicates that the heavens were created first. Why the heavens? Because the heavens are more spiritual. In other psukim it says that the earth was created first. So which is it? Was the earth created first or the heaven created first? And the answer is kan b'maisa. In reality, the heaven was created first. Kan b'machshav, in thought, the earth was created first. In other words, the earth is the lowest level and has the highest source. Physical things are the lowest level and the highest source. So physical mitzvahs are conductors of the Ein Sof. But that a klal, and as a rule, shamayim b'chinas ruchnis, the heaven means spirituality. Ve'eretz b'chinas gashmis, and the earth means materialism and physicality. And therefore, it says on line 36, u'b'maisa, in terms of what actually happened. Kadma shamayim, the heaven comes before the earth. In the way of chain reaction of levels and worlds. The spiritual comes before the material. But in the divine thought, the anticipation of the physical Jew in the physical world doing the physical mitzvah comes first. Because of the principle of Seif Ma'aseh, what happens at the end was God's initial plan. So in physical mitzvahs, you have the Ratzon of the Eibishter, which is Ein Sof, Ki His Galos Ha'er Misev of Kol Alma, because revealing the light of the infinite realm. And revealing the will of God, which is from the light of Kesed, by satisfying the will of Hashem, Bidvarim, Gashmiyim, Mamish, and physical mitzvahs, Mamish. They have the source in the world of extremes. Which is a vessel for the will of Hashem. The will of Hashem is infinite. Physical things have a source in Atzmos. They therefore are a vessel for the will of Hashem and are good conductors for the Ein Sof. So there's two things. There's the mitzvah being a garment, and there's the delight, the revealed delight associated with the comprehension of godliness that the neshama experiences in Gan Eden. So the mitzvah itself, since it is from Sevav Kalam, from Ein Sof, is a good conductor to the delight and the light of Sevav Kalam, in which the neshama wants to experience consciously in Gan Eden. But l'chein, therefore, ha-mitzvahs hem levushim, dafke mitzvahs are the appropriate garments. Asher al yodam, that through them, on the one hand the mitzvah limits, on the other hand the mitzvah holds the Ein Sof. Tuchal ha-neshama lahasig v'lehanes, the soul can reach and be delighted by ataynug vaziv b'Gan Eden, the delight, the infinity in Gan Eden. Line 39 at the end. And therefore, they act as garments. The idea of a garment is clothing don't go internally. Clothing don't become one with us, clothing simply enwrap us, surround us. Which is why you can change clothing and you can tailor clothing, they don't always fit perfectly. Like food, food becomes one with the person mamish, and gives him life. While a garment doesn't become that one with the person, doesn't give him life. It's only indirect. So garments don't achieve as deeply for a person as does food. But on the other hand, we must say, Shiyash b'malbush and Mila Yasei, the clothing on the other hand have an advantage, which is different and higher in its own way than the pneumistic ideas of food and learning and so forth, because they come from the higher levels. Why can clothing surround and protect a person, although they're peripheral, although they're daimim? It's because they come from a higher source. Similarly, food would be the study of Torah, and the garments would be the performance of mitzvahs, that because their source is Ein Sof, they can conduct the Ein Sof. Similarly, the performance of physical mitzvahs. Their sources from the indirect levels. Kesed Elyon. You cannot reveal the infinity of godliness in a revealed and internalized way. But instead, through a physical deed you have Ein Sof, but in the physical deed itself you don't experience it. We can do as we know, because it has a higher source, it falls to a lower level. So physical mitzvahs don't reveal godliness, but they conduct that the neshama in Gan Eden should experience the delight and the Torah and the mitzvahs that they did in Gan Eden. Line 45. Achin, at the same time, this deed of a mitzvah, whose infinity is true but not felt. At the same time, it becomes a screen and a garment which hides and reveals mitzvahs through the mitzvahs. We should experience the Ein Sof without it overwhelming us. And the Rebbe concludes, which is why the neshama comes into this world. In part, if you've ever studied Chassidus, what is the neshama doing here? Mitzvahs, birurim, tshuva, nisyonis, all kinds of things. We're not talking about birurim, we're not talking about tshuva, we're not talking about nisyonis, we're talking only about mitzvahs. Birurim we'll talk about next week. What are mitzvahs? infinity of godliness that has to do with physical acts. And that's why it's a keli for infinity. And when we do those physical acts, we're ultimately privy to an infinite delight or a shine of the infinite delight. And what allows us to hold that infinite delight without it destroying us are the mitzvahs that we did. And this is one aspect of Tachas Yidus HaNeshama, the purpose of the Neshama's descent, going down in order to go up. That idea, I see as a mitzvah through doing mitzvahs. We should be able to experience the light and the delight. Idea Masach, and also the aforementioned curtain. Asher mitzlabeshes HaNeshama, Began Eden, the Neshama in Gan Eden is wrapped. Belavusha mitzvahs, with the garment of the mitzvahs that it performed in its physical lifetime. Umachmas, and sins. Mitzvahs have a source in Ein Sof and Sevav Kalam and Ratzner, like it says in the Geras Kedesh Chavtes. When we did now in this world physically do the mitzvahs which are the will of Hashem, and now we're doing the deed. So in Gan Eden we're going to experience the delight from these mitzvahs. But you must break it up into two: the mitzvah itself and the Chanukah saga, which is what the neshama experiences through the levush of the mitzvah. And she is gala eid on us, the delight of Ein Sof, which will be revealed to the neshama in Gan Eden. When the neshama in Gan Eden puts on those garments, like I said to you before, that Elisha ben Nevoya that Rabbi Elazar ben Dedaya gets the mitzvahs of Yechanan Kein Gadol, and as a result he has conductors for the infinite light of godliness which he created through his tshuva. Tisan Egan Neshama, the neshama will be delighted. But Tainer getting himself built in a pleasure which is infinite. Al Yedei Masach Levush HaMitzvahs now through the garment and the screen of mitzvahs which we described. Asher Heim, that the mitzvahs are bechinas memotzayim, intermediates. Shesharsh Nailim Kesed, the very high sources. Finishtal Shalamata B'Dvarim Gashma came down to very low levels, and therefore you don't see the infinity of the mitzvah itself. But the mitzvah itself, because of its high source, can conduct the tainug of godliness of an neshama in Gan Eden. So the 2 points are: first of all, the garment limits and reveals the godliness to the neshama in a palatable way, and second of all, it holds that light because the mitzvah is infinity, and therefore it's a keli for the infinity of godliness. What about neshamas themselves being garments versus needing the mitzvah to be garments? Let's see how this all develops over the course of the next few weeks as we learn through this Maamar with the help of the Rebbe. And I hope that was delightful.